just wondering, one of the questions we had too was in terms of how much influence the UN research strategies and recommendations have on international environmental law.
So it depends on the topic as to how successful we have been. But I would argue we've been really successful because we're currently negotiating a treaty to deal with plastic pollution. And that's, ongoing as we speak. The Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee will be meeting again in Canada in April. And UNEP did all of the work leading up to that. It established a working group to actually frame what that treaty might contain. And then we were successful in advocating for that treaty to be on foot. And of course, UNEP houses the Minamata Convention, the BRS conventions to deal with chemicals, Convention on Biological Diversity. And we've just negotiated a global framework for chemicals management, the sound management of chemicals and waste. And of course, we have the Kunming Montreal framework, which is about actually trying to prevent and stop the degradation of biodiversity and nature, but also with massive restoration required, which is what we actually need to do to meet mitigation and adaptation targets for climate change. So I'd argue we've been pretty successful so far.
Andrea, just wondering if you could comment perhaps on the key barriers to progress in some of those different program areas, and do they relate more to a lack of available funding and resources in the member countries, or more to blocking by industry or lobby groups? So the fossil fuel lobby is the obvious one there.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, which is surprisingly quite hard to answer. So I would argue it is a resource question for many countries because they are low and middle income countries that do not have the resources to engage significantly across a range of different topics. At the same time, governments are lobbied heavily by industry to maintain particular ways of living, etc. So one of the issues for us is ensuring that we engage with stakeholders, engaged in all issues, but ultimately our role is in convening governments and actually providing the information to governments on the actions they should take. There is a lot of variation across countries, across particular actions. And so broadly, globally, if you think about it logically, countries, the Gulf countries are absolutely reliant on fossil fuels, and they have built all of their societies based on fossil fuel use, on enormous energy, and they have gained enormous wealth. So for them, it's quite a different proposition to phase out fossil fuels than, say, a country like Australia, which is replete with, resources that could have renewable energy and with economic wherewithal to actually undertake that. So there certainly are variances between countries, and it's not just a case of lobbying by industry on particular topics. It does happen, but more often than not, it's actually we need to engage with a range of stakeholders in that area.
And I guess to that end too, just curious about what levers does the UN have to try to encourage countries to stick to their commitments, for example, with regard to emissions reductions?
So if you have an instrument like the Montreal Protocol, which has got very clear targets, thou shalt do X and reduce HFCs by, HCFCs by this time, etc. Across these sectors, you can't transport CFCs, you can't transport particular types of equipment, things like that. So where you've got very strong legal language within a treaty or within a convention or whatever, it works quite well. Where it is voluntary agreements, and remember, not all countries sign on. So you can have, of the 193 countries, for example, you may only have 120 countries that have signed on to, say, the Minamata Convention. And I don't know whether that's the right number for the Minamata Convention, but it probably won't be 193. So it does depend on the nature of that particular multilateral environmental agreement, how many people have signed on to it, and then how tight the particular provisions are and what has been agreed. Because remember, they're agreed across countries. So sometimes in order to get an agreement, to get some action on a particular issue, you compromise on it being legally binding.
Okay. And just something which is obviously very, very relevant over the last number of years, that just wondering if UNEP has a role in countering misinformation and disinformation, which continues to circulate in some sections of the media and also via social media, particularly around the science of climate change, and what strategies might you use to address that?
Uh-oh. Oh, okay, sorry, misinformation. Great question. So do we have a role? Misinformation is rife and disinformation is rife, and particularly now with chat GPT and all the rest of it, it's actually quite easy to present information in a way that is not scientifically valid. The approach that we've taken so far is that where we can correct a piece of information, we do. And so what UNEP is trying to do, and it's part of my role, is that what we put out is scientifically rigorous. But actually a recent initiative is we've been developing an evidence-based GPT. So we've actually been working on with Microsoft an environment GPT, which is based on a corpus of scientifically valid literature, i.e. IPCC reports, etc. And we've been developing large language models so that if you want information about an environmental issue, it gives you the references. So you know exactly where the source of information is for that particular piece of information you're after. So it's a query-based system. We've actually tested it. We've done a pilot on air pollution and climate change. And we actually kind of did a pilot at the recent COP and got feedback on it to improve it so it's more user-friendly. So how we're trying to tackle this is to be a more trusted source of information. So you know if you come to UNEP, it's going to be referenced. You may not necessarily agree with it, but you will have the sources and you will have the information, and not that it comes from anywhere. And so we're building that out so that we can provide that. And of course, with the reports that we develop across the board, we try and make sure that we have the best science available that we put out. We probably publish 150 on 150 topics each year across a wide array of areas.